based on the characteristics of the systems that the government operates. So it's not based on an established boundary like a regional area. It's based on the characteristics of the system that is in fact operating. So when the next proposal comes in, as close as we can get them, we try to do that. And in fact, our process is set up that when one agency requests a channel, unless the other agency cries foul, I'm going to get interference, we let them get as close as they can. We also have other cases where agencies actually are operating on the same channels. I've been in this for many years, and I'm learning new things about the magic of government spectrum, that we often assign the same channels to different people, and it is in fact the timing of them, the time component, that often allows them to mix with one another without causing problems. So I think that's, as we look at the secondary markets, we have to get away from that traditional idea that, well, NASA's going to lease its spectrum. And I think Harold's paper takes the first step toward accomplishing that, getting away from that concept. That in fact, we still have to look at the agencies as a whole, the spectrum as a whole, as opposed to feeling like the agencies now have rights and they're going to rent out that spectrum. So I think the paper avoids a lot of the traditional issues. It avoids the agencies, for instance, having to make public specific locations and frequencies. Now, I realize we're looking at spectrum inventories, and we are going to do our best to be as clear and transparent as possible, but you have to understand the agencies do have concerns about the specific release of their locations, their stations, and the associated frequencies. If you were able, for instance, to cut off a frequency that was doing network control for the energy grid, that sounds pretty significant. If you're able to cut off the FAA's radar data because you're able to block the channel and locations there, that's pretty significant. So those agencies are not apt to want to just hand out that information. I think this begins to work its way around it. It also avoids the inflexibility of giving companies or licensing companies to a specifically narrowly defined band. Where, for instance, as we've been doing the AWS transition, a company has purchased that spectrum. They don't have other options at that point. So when they run into a hurdle with a federal agency, it really gets to be headbutting, calls to Congress. How do we get those guys out of here right now? Whereas if there was some more flexibility on their part, maybe we could avoid some of that. Another part of it is it gets the agencies out of being the bad guy. So, for instance, if you have systems that are responding in this way, real-time auctions, like Karl writes real-time papers, all these things are happening very fast and so on. The fact is that if a channel is not available, the end user, even maybe the end service provider, that's invisible to them. They don't really care as long as the system shifts and gives them another channel. Whereas right now what we have is if there's a blockage, people say DOD or FAA or it's blocking my channel, interfering with my channel. In the same way, for instance, we've had with the garage door openers. Okay? In that particular case, as far as I can see, the sole problem in that situation is that garage door openers are built to operate on one channel. Now, I own a cordless phone at home that has at least 10 channels on it. You can buy them for $15 on sale sometimes. Multi-channel, small devices, not that hard to produce, not that expensive. But the fact that DoD then turned on a system that locked up the single channel in the devices caused lots of problems. And it isn't that DoD wasn't the primary user of the band. The problem was that my grandmother, with their garage door opener, was going to call their congressman and demand that DoD stop jamming, her garage door opener. And let's face it, part of the issue here is that the community of users does not understand the rules. So we have to come up with approaches that satisfy their need and yet don't put them in that position where people who don't understand are wrestling with those who have to get the job done. And then I think the last thing here is The critical aspect is, can this be demonstrated and proven? I've heard some fairly strong words today about what's being done or what can be done. I'm not certain at this point that the white spaces database is an active thing that's producing people getting in, getting out, and so on. I know there's been a lot of talk about it. It's a great idea. Haven't necessarily seen it functioning yet, but all these ideas, I believe, have to be proven. Certainly the agencies do not want to get in a situation where we activate this and then there's a problem. So we're going to have to work through any kind of proving of this. But as we look more into this for the future, we have to look for ways that are going to allow more groups to access the spectrum, use the spectrum to our greater good. And I think ultimately the real incentive to the agencies and everybody else is we only have so much, and we're going to have to figure out ways of sharing.
Okay, so we have about 25 minutes left. And so Dr. Rose is going to respond briefly to some of the comments. And while he's doing that, if you could write your questions down on index cards that I believe you have, then somebody will come around and collect them. And also, as you're answering the question, one other thing I'd be interested in hearing more about, maybe this is Karl, I'm not sure, is how exactly this paper, the econometric part of the paper, the empirical part of the paper, fits in with how it helps make your general case about secondary markets in the federal space. I mean, essentially the econometrics are saying that if you can ask all the questions, that the revenues, you get more revenues in a secondary market than in just a primary auction. But as you said, for the FCC, in the FCC auctions, you're not supposed to consider revenues. In NTIA, you are. But we know that in terms of maximizing social welfare, revenues are not the thing you want to maximize. You can do all kinds of, as you say in the paper, all kinds of things with the rules of the auction or the markets to increase the revenues that are not at all good for public welfare. So, how does this paper help make the point that it would be a good thing? Is it in fact that you're addressing the political economy problem, which people have said that it makes it more attractive to the government to do this, or is it something else? I guess connect the two parts.
Let me answer that last question first, and then I'll let Greg respond very briefly to because nobody wants to do what the economists think right now. But the short answer is the reason we include this is for two reasons. One is there is indeed a political economy, yes, question. The blunt fact is that, and when I wear my pushing the unlicensed hat, I say this somewhat more aggressively as spectrum auctions are the cracked cocaine spectrum policy. That the somewhat nicer version is we have a reality that people want to return on the public asset, the spectrum, which also addresses financial issues. One of the things that we say in the text of the paper, and we address somewhat, recognizing in part the preliminary nature, is that because of those social welfare reasons that you mentioned, we don't think you have to prove that you'd make more money through secondary markets than you would through the traditional spectrum auctions. We do think, though, that it's important to show that this is worth doing. It's worth doing for those in federal policy who are looking towards revenue generation. We also think it's worth doing on the question of how you're going to build a sustainable business model around this, which is one of the questions that's out there. If one of the things is that this is a profitable business, then one aspect of it is public-private partnerships in which you would have a private contractor who would operate the secondary network for some share of the revenue. So we do think that showing that it's out, that there is money to be made here is important in that sense. And finally, it goes to the question to some degree Kathy was asking, which is, how do you show that there's really, a group of people out there that would use this? Could you invest a lot of money in this and then no one show up? We do think that showing that based on existing secondary markets, that this is a system that would make money that helps to establish an overall case that there must be people who are interested in buying this. If, when you look at how secondary markets are working in the private sector, there are people who are purchasing similar services, and that makes money in the private sector.
Yeah, just to try to answer Dr. Wallsten's question in a little more detail. The blunt fact of the matter is that there is no secondary market in existence with respect to federally controlled spectrum. The only secondary markets that exist are with respect to licensed spectrum, which the FCC has allocated. So that if you don't want me to be pulling numbers out of thin air, I have to look at the allocation of licenses to the private sector via secondary market to have any comparenda at all to begin to generate numbers. Now, I agree completely with Dr. Bazelon that, in fact, yes, we are measuring a changing value of spectrum over time. That is precisely what gives, in current secondary markets, the holders of that spectrum the incentive to put it on a secondary market. The fact that they can recoup the value that is increased over time of that spectrum. And I think it's perfectly reasonable to call that a premium arising from the secondary market's existence, because there is no other way except FCC auctions or secondary markets to allocate spectrum to private entities. Now, I don't want to make people's eyes glaze over, so I'll make this really, really quick. Yes, the weighting I use in the paper privileges the CMAs over the REAGs, and Dr. Bazelon argues for privileging the REAGs over the CMAs. But the one fact of the matter is there's never been a REAG allocated by a secondary market in the United States. It simply never happened. Most of the allocations of spectrum in secondary markets that have occurred hitherto have been at the CMA, EA, and BTA levels, and usually pieces of those licenses, not entire licenses. So I choose to use the weighting with privileges to CMAs because empirically, that's what most of the training's been on the secondary markets.
To just once again, in a very brief translation for the non-economists in the room, there are reasons why we made the assumptions that we did in the papers. It's important to get this kind of feedback that Coleman has offered. There's obviously going to be a lot of debate about what is the right model, but we do think, as I think Dr. Bazelon agreed, that there is real evidence that secondary markets work and produce revenue, and the question of how the experts are going to be able to measure this so that we can move forward is something that we've only begun to debate.
The point of the matter is that this is a very preliminary model. I don't claim that it is anything more than a way to start the discussion.
All right. So the first question is to Chris Duffus. It says, your website says there's a white space network functioning in somewhere in Virginia.
Cleveland,
Virginia, and Wilmington, North Carolina. Elaborate. Do those networks use a database?
Yes. Exactly. Yeah, I mean, obviously the rules haven't come out yet, so I mean, we're working on sort of the preliminary rule set with our interpretations as to how they should work. But yes, it does use the database, and every day those radios query the central database and see what channels they can operate on. That said, there is a lot of dynamism going on down in Claudville because there aren't a lot of competing TV licenses in the area. But what's interesting to note about that is that it's been in operation since September of last year, and it's created a lot of value in that community. Not only has it driven the RLEC to provide, broadband service to the community, but in many cases there was a school connected, there was a doctor's office, a local restaurant, a couple other business establishments, and at the time their only alternative was satellite. And even though this was a trial sponsored by one of our business partners, or a couple of our business partners in this, even on it utilizing other spectrum, whether it's Wi-Fi or some licensed band, the cost magnitude to deploy those types of networks, even on a charitable basis, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation wouldn't have given that amount of money to deploy this little network where we cover a couple dozen square miles. Literally for under tens of thousands of dollars on what I call boutique radios, we now provide multiples over the sort of the FCC current definition of broadband to this community, and they've cut off their satellite and some of their other broadband connectivity solutions that weren't as effective.
Yeah. One quick point there to add on. I think we're about 18 months out now from when the FCC adopted the TV white spaces order, and we've yet to actually see the reconsideration petitions dealt with and finalize the rules, nor have we seen the database approved. There was a comment period earlier this year. A number of parties stepped forward and indicated they would, including Google, would be willing to help put together the database and run it. But the commission we're still waiting on action. So that's one of the frustrations from some of us who want to see some movement there. Again, we believe the technology works, but until we get a chance to have it operationalized to the FCC action, we're sort of stuck in limbo. We now have just the small community in Virginia so far that's working with that technology.
And Chris, how complex is this setup compared to where you'd like to be?
This is purely just preliminary, but what I'd like to say is that a lot of white spaces, it's not really about sort of new technology. What we're proposing is within that ecosystem is that there's going to be a standards-based solution. The only thing new is this sort of database allocation mechanism. And again, that's not necessarily a technology thing, that's just a business implementation aspect. And as Rick alluded to, we're waiting for the regulatory environment to catch up with technology and demand in the market.
Another question for Karl, Rick, and Karl. Have you looked into the UK experience with allowing the Ministry of Defense for Martin Cave's recommendations to lease access to military spectrum and keep some of the money or reduce the fees they pay to Ofcom? If so, why not consider it the US? If not, why not?
I can answer that very quickly and say, no, we haven't actually looked at that yet. And in fact, I'll be honest, I wasn't aware of it until the question was asked. I'm very pleased to see other countries experimenting with this as well. And obviously, we want to look at it and see how that will inform the debate.
I think one thing you may find there is that in the UK, the MOD actually was allocated the spectrum. They exercised control over portions of the spectrum. Their own legal structure may permit them to do that, but I think once again we've got these issues within our structure that's not the way we provide spectrum to the individual agencies. DoD doesn't own spectrum in this country for them to then sell or lease to somebody else. So that those things present significant problems. And then the other thing, once again, the agencies making money in our governmental structure is not generally a good way to go.
My favorite contrast to the American system actually is in China, where the military which owns spectrum started a commercial cell phone company. That's better than the spectrum going to waste, but it's not really an option here.
There's also the case of Turkey, which is beginning to experiment in allowing allocation of military spectrum to private uses. But in every case where this happens, you don't have the institutional strictures that the American government has, which makes the cases fundamentally quite different.
Karl, actually, maybe, I mean, you talked about this a little bit, but, oh, yeah, sorry. Karl, you talked about this. You talked about this a little bit, and it keeps coming up that the agencies themselves have basically no incentive to deal with any of this. I mean, many administrations have tried to deal with the problem of federal spectrum not being used in the most efficient way, and it's never gone anywhere. Do you see a productive way forward?
Well, certainly there have been some incentives to the federal agencies, and that certainly historically they know they're not getting any more. So they have operated for years now under the process that if they needed to do things that required more bandwidth, more users, they were going to have to do them within the space they have. So there is some incentive there for them to do that. On the other hand, for instance, there's been a lot of discussion about fees for federal agencies. And once again, one of the troubling aspects here, even if we consider that is a good concept to put forward, we have a variety of agencies operating these bands. Once again, they don't have big contiguous portions that are theirs and theirs alone in terms of geography or frequency and so on. So that, for instance, if one of those agencies in a particular band where there might be hundreds of assignments, one of those agencies decides, well, under the new fee structure, it's costing me a little bit more than I'd like. I'm going to get out of there. Instantly, you may have created a new hole in the Swiss cheese, but you haven't made the cheese any more available to anybody else. All you've done is taken whatever the characteristics of their system are, and you've now made a hole that's exactly that shape and said, well, can somebody fit into that? So individual incentives, I'm not sure, work that great either, but I think the compelling incentive at this point is we're just not making any more spectrum, and we're going to have to get used to operating in an environment where we're having to share with one another and make these processes work. In some cases, that may mean the next band that gets, let's say, licensed for cellular service may be licensed where there's certain geographic areas that they can't use. In other cases, we may have to create some mechanisms that at least at certain times make certain frequencies out of bounds, and that, of course, starts requiring you to make this kind of real-time connection. So we're going to have to look at those things to make it work, and I honestly do not find the agency opposed to that. They just, I think, regularly say, show me how it's going to work, and don't get me in a spot where it's not working. We can't find who's using the interfering devices, or we can't get them back out of our hands.
So that's actually a segue to another question that was asked. It's directed to Karl and Kathy Brown. So if we did have dynamic spectrum access in such secondary markets, I guess including space, would the federal government be allowed to participate in that? Could they access non-federal commercial spectrum for their own use if they want to pay for it?
I mean, certainly, first of all, federal agencies at this point use commercial services for a lot of things. That raises an interesting point. For instance, would they, for instance, be able to design and turn on a radar system in a band in a dynamic way? Probably not. So I think one of the problems gets to be as we start looking at what the real federal operations are, do they fit well into that kind of dynamic capability, that dynamic nature? Oftentimes when we talk about this, everybody thinks of the federal use in the same terms we're thinking of the cellular mobile use, when in fact the government uses of this band are almost entirely not of that sort. They're not systems that participate easily in a network. They're not network concepts. And they're also not systems that easily just shift from frequency to frequency based on availability. With big radar systems, it's just not easy to do.
So I think.
Sorry?
So I think if one starts with radar systems, you get nowhere. So with that question, so I can see that point. The question is, what other kinds of uses are federal agencies using the bands for, and is there an ability here, not by the individual agency, although notwithstanding, I think, the notion that in our government all of these decisions are in one federal agency, NTIA, nevertheless, individual budget decisions are being made in the federal agencies. And the ability to perhaps, I'm a big, this is a perhaps, we're all, as I think we've all said, we're just talking here. The ability to actually use a service that is developed in a dynamic way may well be possible, if indeed they have a use for it. I mean, talk about proof of concept, right? We have to, and I take your point, Karl, about the right language. I think we need to sort out what these uses are to understand where they fit into some commercial offering or not, and where they don't. Taking relocation off the table totally is sort of interesting to me, and we'll have to have a further conversation about that. But I think there are more efficient ways to go at this, and I think right now, just in the public safety debate, we've seen this very issue now back on the table. So when you start to use spectrum for a governmental use, are there ways that one uses the spectrum more efficiently, creates other opportunities for other players to actually start to develop products and services, and also frees up spectrum? I think that's an okay conversation to be having, and recognizing what the constraints and restraints are, and then in a constrained environment, stop the conversation. So.
There was a time, even just on the FCC side of the house, of spectrum allocation, where there was boundaries that no longer exist and no longer make sense. And so once upon a time, in the private land mobile, separate allocations for movie production sets, right? And that's just silly. In today's view, that's a silly thing to do, and we don't do it anymore. The division between federal and non-federal is also archaic and probably not so important anymore. And there should be a lot more crossover, and there is starting to be in the public safety community in the 700 megahertz band. There's lots of talk of public-private partnerships and the D-block, whether that's public safety or commercial. So that's happening. On the constitutional point of budget control, let me just say, the one thing to say is that there is one way, it's not ideal, but there's one way around this problem, which is to not use money. So to the extent that you can barter, you can get around this. When they want to upgrade a system, if a private company can pay for the upgrade of the system, then they might be in a position to capture some benefits from it. And therefore the benefits do get tied to the agency.
And also, why don't you all have the last word too?
Yeah, I just want to very quickly address that point that we've been going on a couple of the other points here. We, in this paper, did not propose that the federal government would buy spectrum on from private entities in the same way that we're proposing that the federal government could create a market in which private entities would be able to dynamically lease federal spectrum. It's certainly an intriguing idea. The problem of very real budget constraints for federal agencies is important, and it's one of the things that needs to be taken into consideration when we look at the mix of what we're going to do about overall spectrum policy for the federal government, not just allocation or assignment of frequencies, but also how we want our agencies to be able to innovate, fulfill their mission. I would take this back to something I said at the beginning, that when we talk about unlicensed, one of its great virtues is its flexibility. And that one of the problems that we actually have sometimes in these debates is when we talk about licensed spectrum, we're very focused on cellular. I would say it's a huge blind spot as we think about spectrum policy. Even the notion of the spectrum crisis is driven by the iPhone and the smartphone revolution, and much less about the unmet needs in the industrial sector or in other areas, which, as Kathy and other cellular providers can say, are growing markets, machine-to-machine communication, for example. I think all of the major cellular companies have machine-to-machine units, which represent a growing market for wireless capacity that's just different from cellular capacity. So when we look at this question of, what sort of public-private partnerships may be useful, what sort of financial business models might emerge, and how we kind of go down this road, the closing points I think I want to make is that we're doing a lot of the same work for any approach. When we talk about the question of should we do this as opportunistic sharing unlicensed, should we do this as trying to clear an auction, should we do this as some sort of mix where we'll have auction in some places and we can't reallocate others, or the model that we propose is a supplement to all of these of spectrum leasing. The real thing that we're going to keep in mind is we're going to have to do the same work no matter what, because we've got to figure out what the dimensions are of federal systems that are being used. We have to figure out what the dimensions are of neighboring systems so that we don't have interference with the folks next door. And we have to figure out how this is all going to fit with the expectation of users who don't care about the debates that we're having here today. They just want their cell phones to keep working and their business applications to keep going. For all of these reasons, I just want to flip a little bit what we've said. It's true at the beginning of the debate about this approach, but I want to emphasize that the work that we're doing for any of the approaches to federal spectrum is going to serve the same purpose in the analysis of whether to have dynamic leasing as a vital part of that mix.
So I guess that's next panel will be at 11 o'clock, and there'll be a quick break. So please join me in thanking Harold and
thank Gigi and the people from Public Knowledge for making this event possible, and my fellow panelists for participating, and all of you for coming out today. Thank you very much.